And to me, magic centers on profound insights. Moments of magic are moments when you see a truth that you'd never seen before that has profound impact. And that often comes from a combination of deep understanding and connection from the area of understanding to another field or another piece of data that is not in the linear path.
Welcome to Magic Academy podcast today, and we have a very exciting guest, Ben Nelson. He is the founder of Minerva Project and Minerva University, world's #1 innovative universities you can ever find. And whenever we're thinking about universities, it's usually very traditional. You go to a course, you take the course, and then you do assignment, and you take the grades and you graduate. But Ben has found a way that totally shift how we should rethink and redo university. So very excited that we have Ben here with us today. So we're gonna have a very exciting conversation. Welcome to our podcast, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me. Very, very happy to be here.
Excellent. So for those people who haven't found you on the World Wide Web yet, how would you introduce yourself in 30 seconds?
I would say that I have a very unique privilege of being focused on reforming global education. And that means to shift it from this very short-term transactional cram, test, forget model that we all know exists in high schools and universities, et cetera, to learning how to actually apply what it is that you've learned, to use it for the rest of your life. And that's really at the core of the Minerva mission.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Like whenever we're talking about education, or in another word, like human development, learning, skill development, it should be much more possibilities than just sit there and consume content and turn everybody into a consumer rather than a producer in this like space of human development. So can you share with us what was your kind of the origin story behind Mera project, and what comes behind the name?
Sure.
What does this name like want to what story this name want to tell?
Sure. The whole concept started actually when I was a first-year student as an undergraduate 30 years ago. And I took a course about the history of the American university and why it looked so different from European universities at the time. Because effectively, European universities were built to generate slaves. They were generating people who were subjects of either the cross or the crown, either the church or the monarchy, right? And that's why they lived.
Where do the non-slaves go to school then? Not university, then what?
Everyone was a slave. You forget that if you are living in medieval Europe, right, and you are a subject of a king, you're not a free person. Your life exists to serve the crown. And the idea of a modern society where the human, him or herself, is sovereign, that was a unique concept at the time that the United States was formed. And they needed a new kind of educational system around that. Not an educational system that taught you to do a thing in the service of your monarch or your church, something that allows you to be able to, or a set of knowledge, what the founding fathers refer to as practical or useful knowledge, that you can apply no matter what it is you chose to do, because it was your choice. And
Free
you could
will.
say, hey, I'm going to one day be a shopkeeper, and the next day I may be a senator. Or I may be a farmer, and the next day I could be an ambassador, right? Or I could be a doctor, and then I could be president. And not only would you be switching careers radically when it was time for you to serve your country, serve your fellow countrymen and women, citizens, but you'd also be called upon to make decisions on who to vote for to represent your interests. So you chose who was going to represent your interests which is a very different skill set than knowing how to farm or keep your shop, etc. And so the idea was that an educational system that needed to teach you the various disciplines or arts that allowed you to be a free person or have liberty. And that is where the term the liberal arts came from. The liberal arts has nothing to do with the humanities or poetry or what we consider today to be fine art. It has everything to do with the practical or useful knowledge that you need in order to be a free and franchised citizen. And 30 years ago, I realized that universities were no longer teaching those things. All they were doing was effectively teaching subject matter, like the old European universities did. But instead of, in the American model, teaching one subject matter, you taught one subject matter as your major, and you could dabble with a bunch of other stuff at your leisure. And I thought that was a big problem, because modern society today, all over the world, doesn't even matter what kind of government you live under, overwhelmingly, people have choice. They have choice in career. They switch careers from time to time. They participate in their government, whether or not they live in democracy or not. They are civically engaged. Sometimes they protest, right? And so they need that practical knowledge more than ever. But our higher education system today, not just in the United States, but all over the world, in many places where it's never reformed, is actually worse than it was conceptually, at least, at the founding of the country. And I thought that somebody had to do something about that. And so I spent a number of years trying to figure out what that was. I came up with a concept of Minerva, initially as an idea on how to reform an existing Ivy League university. And then years later, when I couldn't implement these changes as an undergraduate, I came back to it with the idea of starting a new institution. And the institution, called Minerva, after the Roman goddess of wisdom. The Roman Republic was the original model that the founding fathers of the United States used to model the American Republic. So Minerva was the patron goddess of that. In fact, in Washington, D.C., iconography of Minerva dictating the Constitution. And so it was very much that type of enterprise. And they called it the Minerva Project, because this was going to be the project for the rest of my life, to try to build an example university, Minerva University, that would enable other universities to be inspired by what we do, and then to help them reform, to adopt these more systematic approaches of teaching practical knowledge.
What are some key characteristics or values that Minerva exudes or carry on? What are some key values?
Yeah. So the most important is really our mission. So Minerva exists to nurture critical wisdom for the sake of the world. So if in that, there are three really crucial components. The first one is this idea, the centeredness around critical wisdom. Well, first, wisdom in general is knowing what to do in a situation you've never encountered before. That's what a wise person is. A wise person is not just somebody who knows what to do because they've had that exact same thing happen to them. That's just memory, right? That's not wisdom. Wisdom is to be able to see a new situation, one that you haven't seen before, but still know what to do. And it's exceedingly difficult. Now, it's particularly difficult not because it just takes years to make mistake after mistake until you see the pattern recognition, but even more so because when wisdom happens naturally, as we encounter it normally, people don't know why they know these things. They can't really explain, because it's just a pattern recognition that their brain made subconsciously, oftentimes. Critical wisdom is one that is explicable, that you can explain to somebody else why it is that you are wise. You know how to construct the solution, how to deploy that practical knowledge in the ways that matter when you encounter them. And so the core idea of critical wisdom is really the most animating factor around Minerva. The first part about it is nurturing, right? Critical wisdom cannot just be handed down. It's not something that I can just tell you, right? And then, hey, I tell you these things, now you're wise. Doesn't work that way. I can nurture
We hope.
right?
Because
To
that'll be
nurture
easier.
you,
It's much easier.
right? It would be great if that were possible, but you actually have to become wise yourself. And so you have to go through processes to learn, to understand, to internalize, to apply until you actually know what it means to be wise. And so the process of nurturing that wisdom is crucial. And then to what end? Most institutions think about their learner as the product or the customer, right? And they say, no, 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 we have to worry about our learner, make sure they graduate, make sure they complete. We owe it to them.
Because
I
that's
don't think about
what's
that.
being measured. That's what being measured by the certification and
Correct.
the
People look at the metrics.
accreditation.
Exactly. Everybody looks at how many people did you bring in, how many people graduated, etc. We think about our responsibility to society as a whole. Why do we nurture critical wisdom? So that somebody can become a banker? I don't care about that. So that one person gets the slot in dental school, whereas another person doesn't? Who am I to determine who should go to dental school and who shouldn't? My goal is to make sure that those who have critical wisdom are making decisions of consequence. That means decisions that impact the lives of others more than their own, hence, for the sake of the world. Right? There is no place anymore in the modern era to make decisions that are win-lose, because ultimately we're too connected. If anything we should have learned from COVID or from the various conflagrations that are happening around the world, there are no winners when there is conflict. It's only loss. It's only a degree of loss, right? There's no winner from economic turmoil. There's no winner from health turmoil. There's no winner from a war. And the collateral damage isn't just the warring parties. It's everybody, right? The whole world, because Russia decided to invade Ukraine, the whole world paid more for their bread. There were ramifications all over the world. Now, of course, the ramifications were the most severe in Ukraine, but it doesn't isolate anybody. And so we have to think about solutions that are holistic as opposed to piece by piece. And so if you're going to deploy critical wisdom, you really have to orient people to understand, again, in our core value, that we are in a human project, that we're not in a tribal project, we're not in a country project, we're not in a community project. That may have made sense 10,000 years ago. You had your tribe, those were your people. What happened in the tribe next door didn't really matter. Certainly what happened in the tribe 100 miles away didn't matter. And that's where you were to survive. Today's tribe is everybody. And we've got to think about that dynamic, or we're going to repeat bigger and bigger disasters with greater frequency.
As we cultivate and develop those critical wisdoms in current and future generations, and also like current leaders across organizations, 100, Fortune 3000, you name it. The first step is cultivating and nurturing that sense of wisdom. What's the second and third step?
The first step in and of itself is
Is
very involved, right? Because wisdom is multifaceted. A lot of people in life, just think about the number of people who encountered, young, old, etc. Think about how many people who are truly wise. Usually it's very few. And then think about in what ways are they wise? They're rarely similar, right? So usually as you put together or various pieces of knowledge, practical knowledge, different people, as they acquire them by accident, acquire different kinds of practical knowledge. Some people are extremely wise in aspect number one, and somebody else may be very wise in aspect number two, and sometimes there's overlap and sometimes there isn't. The project of nurturing critical wisdom is a very long one, and you can oftentimes add more and more components to it. So that is one aspect which is really important. The second, however, is you have to enable the learner to translate their wisdom to action, to application, to the real world. Because if it just maintains in theory or being cerebral, then you can't actually demonstrate the value of your wisdom to anybody else. So a core component after you attain the frameworks that allow you to be wise is for you to have practice in applying them in the real world and then seeing what happens when the application of those frameworks encounter the complexity of life, right? And as you continue to go through that process, you become more and more able and ready to make those decisions or to inform those decisions that affects the lives of many other people. And so that process requires the foundation. It requires you to have the ability to understand the frameworks and apply them broadly. But the project of deploying wisdom doesn't stop at the end of a formal education. It has to actually begin during your formal educational process, but then has to continue for the rest of your life. And so,
just like the
really thinking
lifelong
about those steps,
learning.
that's really what's crucial.
I see. And to ask you this very basic question, what is critical wisdom?
If you want to have the technical definition, at least in our book, the technical definition is that wisdom is the appropriate application of practical knowledge in novel contexts. Okay, so that means that you are in a novel context, you're in a situation you've not been in before, you are able to correctly or appropriately decide what cognitive tool or piece of knowledge you will apply in that situation, and you apply it well. That is what wisdom is, right? Kid is jumping on a bicycle without a helmet, and you say you should put your helmet on, right? Now, that's not really wisdom, that's just knowledge. But if somebody is thinking about, let me go and play American football and bang my head against other people without very good protection, somebody should say, you know what? That's unwise. It's unwise because head trauma is really not a very good thing, right? And we understand how head trauma works, etc. We wear helmets when we ride bicycles in order to protect us from head trauma. And when we purposefully inflict head trauma over and over again, it can have some pretty deleterious effects long run. So that's the ability to take a piece of knowledge that you know from one context, which is not requiring wisdom. It's just because you know it. And then think about, how do I actually apply that in a very different context? So knowing to make that connection, that analogy, and then knowing the implications of it, or at least the implications around it, helps you understand that's a good example of applied wisdom.
I think as you were talking about this example, that reminds me, one of the most recent example is AI. Like the AI just came out of AI has been here for a long time and going through their ups and downs, and recently just become popular. And it's being posing a lot of questions and are seeking wise decisions and wise leaders in terms of like, how would AI impact learning development in the workplace? How would AI impact all kinds of careers? What is the wise application and perspective when you're looking at AI, and how can we apply that in this innovative situations with this innovative tool?
We have to understand a few things. We use AI as a catch-all term, but it's like asking, how does electricity help? AI is a very large. The part of AI that we are most animated about right now, because of the great advances that have been made in it over the past 18 months, is the idea of a large language model, artificial intelligence. What does a large language model do? A large language model actually does what it sounds like it does. It takes a giant amount of language-based information, right? Sometimes visual information, etc., but an existing set of information, and it is able to compile it and put it together in extraordinarily deep ways. And so you can go and ask a large language model to say, hey, tell me a reason why you should do X. Now give me the counter argument. And it will be able to go and look at everything that is ingested in literature, which is enormous, billions of pieces of data. And it can provide you an exceptionally clear and usually good answer on both sides. You can even ask it, what's more likely to be true? And it will look at the literature and look at everything that is out there and say, this concept is mentioned 60% of the time, and this concept is mentioned 28% of the time, and therefore you've got a 2-to-1 likelihood that this is more likely than the other. It doesn't exactly say that, but it can in theory. However, that's not thinking. That is taking a flat view of the world, even if it says, hey, this is a more credible source than that source is, and just presenting you what is broadly known. What it can't do is say, look, the majority opinion is this. There's a pretty strong minority opinion, which is that. Turns out they're both wrong. And here's why. That's thinking. That is general artificial intelligence, in theory, should be able to do that. Our intelligence, with the right frameworks and tools, is able to do that. But we do not have those tools by accident. We have to be taught these tools. We have to be able to use them. And a large language model can get us out of the business of compilation and analysis of information, especially as it gets more and more accurate over time. Artificial intelligence requires us to be even more expert at reasoning, be even more expert at discernment, be even more expert at coming up with combinations of information to create new knowledge rather than rely on the knowledge that's already out there. And so that is the major project of education of humans moving forward.
And I also read a research, like if we keep using what AI has produced and feed the AI, it starts to the intelligence starts to downgrade because it's like self-recycling without
Correct.
human input. It's gonna be like
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And look, and in some regard, you have to understand why that would be. Because there are some pieces of knowledge where the divergent points of view are silly, right? For example, people who still believe that the earth is flat, right? There are people who believe the earth is flat. That is a stupid idea. And it's just dumb. And even though that concept is out there, you can imagine that a self-referential AI will eventually just dump out those nut job claims and say, look, you know what? The earth is not flat, it's round, and here we go, and here's all the reasons why, and is a fact, etc. And sometimes you want to get rid of junk. The problem is there's an enormous amount of things that are generally accepted, which are false, right? Either because we don't know them yet, or because they're popular to believe, even though they're not true, because the press has picked up on an idea, because it's been amplified or published, or people with big megaphones say some things. I'll give you a very simple example from the science of learning. There is in most places you go, there is an accepted principle that people learn in different ways, right?
Learning styles. Thinking about the same thing.
Learning styles is a fallacy, right? It's just empirically not true. But most people talk about learning styles as if it is true, right?
And
now,
GPT constantly produced writings about learning styles. So I'm like,
correct.
Okay.
Correct. So you could imagine that if GPT doesn't know how to value expert opinion versus not, that eventually, if it was self-referential, it'll only reference that people have learning styles, and it wouldn't reference the fact that learning styles are nonsense. So there's a reason why things would occur, right, that are positive, but then there are those negative side effects. And we have to think about that. And again, this is why human intelligence or general intelligence is so important.
Yeah. And let's come back to the kind of the previous question we've been talking about, the critical wisdom. In the process of cultivating the critical wisdom, what role do you think curiosity or childlike wonder play? Or is there a space for that?
Yet another fallacy. Ken Robinson, may he rest in peace, had this TED Talk video that said, oh, we're born with this great curiosity and the system beats it out of us and it's totally terrible and we've got to get back childhood curiosity, all the rest. Empirically false. It's
Really?
total false. It's complete nonsense. But because
Oh.
it was on a TED video, everybody's like, oh, TED said it, therefore it's true. No, it's not true. It's just empirically not true. The reality is that a prepubescent brain is wildly different than a postpubescent brain.
What?
Right? Just think.
Can you define the term? What does that
Sorry.
mean?
So pubescent means before puberty versus after puberty. Puberty, the time when you develop from a child into an adult, roughly between the ages of 10, 11 to 14, 15 or so, right? The puberty, right? Now, we know this is a fact. So as an example, when you meet an individual who has learned a foreign language at the ages of 4, 5, 6, 7, or that's been an immigrant, you cannot tell that language is not their native language. If you meet their sibling who is 10 or 11 when they first learn that language, they will have an accent for the rest of their lives. That is because of the nature of how we learn, right? At different stages of our brain development. And so that is actually a great fallacy that we have to go back to the kind of brain we had in before puberty in order to be able to be creative or unlock things, etc. It's also because we don't really understand what creativity is, right? Creativity is largely the ability to assemble what into things that are unknown or that are unknown to you. Sometimes the greatest creativity comes from deep expertise. And so it's not that you are a child and you are like curious about everything and then you're drawn to something and like, oh, now I've come up with this amazing thing. Children say some amazing things. They also say a lot of nonsense, right? Now, we recognize sometimes the interesting things is we remember them, but you can't equate children as this amazing creativity machine because oftentimes kids are copying, they're copying poorly, they don't understand what they're saying, they make a claim which for us we ascribe meaning to that they didn't mean, right? And so it's and it's also a fantastical thing. It's like saying here's an Olympic athlete, right? And we want the Olympic athlete to be able to go back and become a master musician. They're just different skills that the body is able to do at different phases of life. And so this idea of wonderment and curiosity as a purview of the prepubescent brain is just, there's nothing could be further from the truth.
So
you could be interested or disinterested in a lot of different areas. Now you are much more able to absorb information at an early age, but it's much harder for you to make sense of it. So that's a very, very big difference. You cannot teach a normal pre-puberty human to be wise because you cannot teach somebody who does not have a fully developed brain to make the kinds of connections that are already difficult to make for somebody who has a fully developed brain. And so that period of puberty is really crucial to make a transition from one phase to the other.
And I will circle back the question to the critical wisdom. You said that usually it takes longer time for us to develop that critical wisdom and post puberty, because that's where, based on what you said, if we're interested, we can still absorb a lot of information and our brain will be much more able to make wise decisions. Is there a way to potentially expedite the skill in learning and applying critical wisdom in fastly changing environment? Because the question behind that is like the world is changing so fast. It's much faster than previously, and we feel like we have to apply critical wisdom almost every day. So how do we expedite
Well,
that potential process?
well,
And does
it's
curiosity play a role? Does interest play a role? What's
well, the most important thing is dedication to actually learning and applying. So the most important factor is the commitment to learn and to incorporate those frameworks of thinking into your day to day. That just, and look, expedite. Everybody says, hey, let's wave a wand, and there's no test for wisdom. There's no 1 day workshop that'll make you wise. It just doesn't work that way. Learning happens through spaced, deliberate practice. That's how our brains work, our post-pubescent brains, right? You need to be exposed to an idea, apply it, then apply it right away, then apply it with a little bit of space, a little bit of more time that has passed, and a little bit of more, again and again and again. And that's per concept. And not only do you have to space it out, you have to move it from context to context deliberately. So you have to apply it when you create your own work. And then you have to apply that same idea when you critique somebody else's work. You have to be able to apply it when you think on your feet. You have to be able to apply it when you have time to be deliberative and weigh the idea over time. You have to be able to apply it when you are voting versus when you're reading the news versus when you're doing your job versus when you're in interpersonal interactions with friends or family members. Same concepts, different ways of applying them. That just takes time. Now, the acceleration is a Minerva model allows a high school graduate, if they take a Minerva high school curriculum, or a college graduate, if they take a Minerva college graduate, to have an order of magnitude more frameworks than who we consider to be wise at 80. That's a massive acceleration. But it requires years of study, right? It just doesn't require decades of accidental learning.
So fast forward as we look into the future with continuously exciting development of technologies like AI, virtual reality, simulation, neural, like machine brain networks and all that. Based on your perspective and your experiences, if you look into the future, how would practical wisdom can potentially be cultivated, developed, and expedited, leveraging without being a slave of those technology, but like master them and leverage them for that particular purpose? How would that look like?
Look, first and foremost, there are ways in which technologies are going to be deployed that we can't imagine right now. Broadly, how do you use technology to further a cause? You use technology not in order to do the things that you're currently doing, but to unlock things that were until that point impossible to do. That's a really important differentiation. So if you think about meaningful technology, the introduction of the internal combustion engine, like the big impact wasn't that it allowed you to go to the corner grocer faster than a horse and cart. That wasn't the point. You could go from your house to the corner grocer in 1870 just fine. You could walk, right? Yeah. Was it more comfortable when it's raining? If it was a 15-minute walk, do a 2-minute drive? Sure. That wasn't the killer app, right? Traversing distances that you couldn't traverse before, having greater levels of safety, right? Connecting people, enabling the kind of community growth, enabling cities to be more and more functional, enabling the concept of the suburb to exist, where you have people live further away from their work geographically and then condense together. Those were the implications of the internal combustion engine, plus I'm sure many others of people who know the space that I don't. And so the same question needs to be asked of these technologies. It's not, well, what are we already doing? And how will these things allow us to do it in a different way? I always and told, oh, virtual reality is so great because you can fly through the pyramids in Egypt. Guess what? You've been able to put in a CD-ROM in the 1980s into a computer, right? And have a very rich graphical interface that showed you the insides of the pyramids. Nobody used it. It's not that compelling. And so we can't just pretend that the technology is going to be the solution. The question is, what is it that we're trying to do? And then how can the technology facilitate it in a way that without that technology, it was up until a point impractical or impossible?
I think one thing that I can think of, I'm trying to bring it down to your previous example where you were talking about practical wisdom. I'm saying critical wisdom. And I think one part of it is like when you're thinking about potentially condense it, you're talking about apply the wisdoms across different contexts purposefully. So one idea I was like thinking about when you're just talking about virtual reality could be virtual reality can potentially design a interactive scenario where all these contexts and all these situations can be purposefully designed, and then we can train people through those scenarios so they can potentially be exposed to a wide multitude of scenarios and contexts to practice their transfer of practical wisdom in different situations.
Correct.
That could potentially condense like a 1 month course into potentially like a week if they get exposed to that context.
Because why would that technology enable you to do that? So right now, for example, if you want to give somebody that multitude of experiences, you can give them a case study, you can have them go into their backyard, you can assign them things. The rate limiting factor isn't the generation of ideas, because you generate ideas and then you can use them with multiple learners. It isn't the delivery of ideas to people. You can just tell them, do this, then do this, then do that. It is how long does it take for the brain to experience and process. That's the rate limiting factor. Now, there may be a technology in the future that allows us to talk directly to neurons and tell them up a millionth of an inch this way and over, and all of a sudden program enhanced, put the, what is it, that new company that Elon Musk
a
launched,
neural link,
first,
something like that, like a chip.
right, the chip in the brain. So that may provide a significant shortcut at some point in the future. That is a technology which is, let's just say, highly nascent right now.
Very interesting. Much more to explore. The more that we know, the more that we don't know. That's the beauty of. Nice. So thank you so much, Ben. I think before we move to the magic portion of this conversation, let me do a brief recap for our audience. So far, we've talked about Ben's story and his founding missions behind Minerva and where this Minerva kind of word come from. It's come from the wisdom, God of wisdom, and how he emphasizes on the importance of the critical wisdom, the sort of wisdom that can be applied and make good, wise decisions in innovative situations, leveraging what we already know, create something that we don't know, or make decisions that's in an unknown environment. We also talked about the concept of AI, how could potentially AI or virtual reality or other type of technology can potentially impact and potentially expedite the learning journeys for people to acquire those sort of critical wisdom. And another thing that really stood out is that the ability to make decisions for the mass, for people that's other than ourselves, and the decisions for the human community, the society, and because we are living in a interrelated world right now, and anything that we do is going to be impacting for everybody else. So the decision is never a single factor, it's like a multi-factor. So that's very important perspective for all of us to get to familiar with as we move into the new world where new technologies and new changes will happen. So as we move to this magic part of the conversations, I would ask you, Ben, I know we're talking about pre-puberty and post-puberty brain and how that's different. I think age 11 is right post-puberty. So we have a fairly functional, full like a functional brand. So my question would be, what did Ben enjoy creating or doing, and time disappeared when you were around 11 or post puberty times?
Post-puberty is usually about 13 or so. So a couple of years later, 13,
Sure.
14. What did I enjoy creating? I like to perform by telling jokes when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, I don't really tell jokes anymore, but back then I loved humor. And to me, I didn't like to create jokes. I didn't have that skill to put them together, but I liked embellishing and performing in telling jokes. And so I enjoyed that creative outlet at that age.
That's interesting. I think humor has a strong power, like healing, but also getting people interested, overcoming cognitive overloads potentially when in the learning process. I think it has a
Right.
huge benefit. That's great. And then, was there any particular challenge that you have to go through to become who you are, Ben Nelson, as of 2024?
I don't know about
Among
challenge, but
many challenges.
when I was going to college, I noticed that I reflected on my time in high school, and I realized that I grew quite a bit. I changed as a person. And I said, when I look back at myself when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, I wasn't upset with who I was at the time. But today being when I was 18, and I looked back, I said, you know what? That 16-year-old was a moron, right? Which most young people would look back at their younger selves and say, oh, I didn't know a bunch of stuff, and now I know more.
We're doing our best when we're
Correct.
16
It wasn't a
and
judgment call. It was just I had grown. And I made a rule for myself. When I went to college, I said, listen, to me, I did these conversations with myself, strangely enough. And I said, look, I want to challenge myself so that at any point when I'm in college, I could pause and think about who the individual was that occupied my body 12 months before. And if I recognize that person, I'm doing something wrong. And unbeknownst to me, between that moment, even before, until the age of 26, that was always true. Now, what I didn't know was that at 25, your frontal lobe is fully developed in your brain. And so it is true that you are constantly a different person, right, in that period. And especially if you're focused on your own internal development. Now, one of the reasons why I say that is that today there is this bizarre trope that people use about being their authentic selves or being who they are, etc. at the ages of 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. That is the most awful, toxic, regressive idea possible. You should always reject who you are because you want to be a better person, right? And the argument of even now at my age, it's not like at 26 I stopped evolving. It's just that the rate of evolution slowed down. But even today, when I think of myself, I'm 48 years old today. When I think of myself at 38, I don't recognize that person. And I don't want to recognize that person, right? Because if I did, then how am I becoming a better human, right? Why would I be self-satisfied and think, especially at an even younger age, oh yeah, I got it all figured out. You have that attitude, you can't be wise. It is impossible because the definition of being wise requires you to be able to process the world around you using tools that you didn't have before. And so you are going to change. You're going to change your values. You're going to change your perspectives. And that's a good thing. Heaven forbid if I today had the exact same values I had as a 16-year-old. Heaven forbid if anybody at the age of in their late 40s had the same values they had as a 16-year-old. Not a good thing. And we've got to encourage people to reserve judgment, right? Rather than just say, oh, I'm right and I am who I am and leave me alone, etc. And allow them to grow. allow them to change, allow them to experience. And then once their frontal lobe is fully developed, as their rate of growth starts to slow naturally, okay, now get a little bit more comfortable about, okay, this is the nature of where I lean. Of course, there are things that are similar. There are things that are similar to me today as they were when I was a teenager, but it's a smaller and smaller amount, right? And it's important that we encourage that in people as opposed to make it a crisis or a challenge, rather than thinking that at some point in time you wake up and now you know who you are. Just think it's silly.
I think as long as we're genuinely interested in growth and develop and driven by our innate curiosity or desire to grow, automatically as we grow, we're being authentic. And
Exactly.
we are
Exactly.
developing our own pathway. So
Right.
being authentic is not a state status. Like it's not like
Exactly right.
It's like a movement.
Exactly right.
Love that. I love that. So I know the magic may seem like once you have the magic or you don't have the magic, and I think integrating into what you're saying is it's always evolving. So what is your evolving magic?
You're asking the wrong person about magic. I grew up and told there is no such thing as magic, but I do. Look, we oftentimes talk about the Minerva magic and what Minerva magic is all about. And to me, magic centers on profound insights. Moments of magic are moments when you see a truth that you'd never seen before that has profound impact. And that often comes from a combination of deep understanding and connection from the area of understanding to another field or another piece of data, right? That is not in the linear path. To me, that's the kind of magic which is central to what we do at Minerva, what we teach, but also in how people experience Minerva. When there are these moments that come together of just exceptional beauty, and that beauty is attained by that marriage of deep expertise and connection to a seemingly unrelated piece of information or field.
I'm just thinking that information just so beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I know we're a little bit over time, but there's another question. So when you're talking about this mineral magic, and you also do like consultations, helping corporate partners to solve unresolved challenges. So how do you usually implement or practice those sort of menorah magic within a workspace or among leaders, among decision makers?
Yeah, we teach in our undergraduate program, for example, 80 different frameworks, more than 80 different frameworks for students that they repeat in context after context. When we enable our partners to do professional learning or executive education, we may teach 3 of them or 4 of them or 5 of them, right? Because you don't have years for somebody to learn everything, but you make interventions in providing those frameworks or lenses that they can apply repeatedly right away. And so it's very much a similar process, just at a smaller scale or smaller scope, if you will, than it is for somebody who can devote 3-4 years just to their growth of their intellect.
That's beautiful. Yeah, so thank you so much, Ben. And it's been a wonderful conversation. You get me like thinking constantly. And I really love how you are talking about the magic of how the deep insight cross discipline, cross dimension, and everything just evolve and form a beautiful deep insight. This is wonderful. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us and today on our podcast. And for those who are interested to get to know Ben, get connected with Ben, his information will be in the show notes below. We encourage you to connect, and hopefully this community will grow and will bring mutual benefit for more and more people in our human village, human global village.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ben.